wanted to show you that because of a quote in Ingold that has always interested me, that the Earth has been and continues to be racked by geological forces acting on such a scale as to make the most impressive feats of human engineering seem puny by comparison. Which is difficult to imagine. Every year that I teach that, I think, is it really puny, Ingold? We're warming up the whole Earth now. That's not puny, is it? So then I had to break out, or it was tweeted out, this billion years of tectonic plate movement, which does make everything we're doing seem pretty puny. And of course, I showed you that other 1-minute video of like, how did I get here? And and that was like the last 6 million years or so. Well, maybe a billion too. So today's chapter is subtitled Globes and Spheres. No, it's titled Globes and Spheres. The Globes and Spheres chapter, that's the title. The subtitle is, we'll talk about that later. Globes and spheres. So we have two perspectives here, the globe and the sphere. Where do we learn about these globes? Yeah.
Globes don't feel like thinking of the world as a globe doesn't make it as personal as a sphere does.
Yeah, thinking of a world as a globe makes it all. Where do we see these globes? Where do we get to see them?
From space.
Space, and where did you see your first globe? Yeah, we usually see them on, we see the, it's the idea of the world from space, or especially we usually see it in school on the maps, right? On television, or maybe if somebody bought one for you. A world known by maps, the kind of world that we get to know from being in school. It's not so personal. It's when you come in and are made to look at the map, and you're made to think, I want to take a look at a few maps. You start thinking of the world as like, that it's all in these painted colors, that there's these places, and there's, the pink people of the pink land of Brazil. It all has numbers and colors, and you have to memorize these things. I was very fortunate growing up because my mom said, when I was exposed to a map like this, she said, I hate this map. So what's wrong with this map? There's several things that are wrong with it. Why does this map give us a weird impression of the world? Yeah.
It's not an accurate representation. Like it's a projection. It isn't to scale exactly.
It's a projection. Yeah, it's one of our worst projections, because here's the equator. And as we all know, the equator is supposed to divide two equal halves, but the equator is about a third up. And so this projection makes the whole Northland very amplified. So one could grow up believing that Greenland was as big as South America. In fact, South America is 9 times as big as Greenland, but never know that. The one thing that this map did that is nicer than some maps is it didn't split Asia into 2 parts. This is the map that sometimes we see in classrooms, at least in the United States, where like the US is in the middle and there's 2 Chinas, which is an interesting view of the world. Actually, my grandparents or my in-laws parents' house. There's one, I was trying to find it. It actually has both the terrible projection and the United States in the middle. This one at least has an equator that is close to the middle, and the projection is a little bit better. So somehow they had done both. We still live in this. This one's a little bit better in terms of putting the equator in the right place and making it more like a circle, a globe. Still, you know, this notion that everyone has a place and a border, and that nations come as colors is an interesting thing. I mean, there's no reason that north, of course, should be at the top, as there's no natural basis for that. I find if I look at this map too much, I get dizzy. I can't. It makes me feel like everything's upside down. I do wonder if, you know, if we grew up with maps like this, we would think about the world differently. Don't think. This is not, I don't see this that much. All right, so in the globe's perspective, we see the maps that we study in this school, and it's a world that we live sort of on top of. All the countries are painted on, and we live on the world. And actually, Willa, you picked up on this as being a colonial world. A world to be occupied. Once had a game that it was called, it was like an explorer game, and you're supposed to be, it's just embarrassing that I had that, you're supposed to be exploring Africa, you know, when you're supposed to be colonizing Africa. This thing was, it's like, it was the continent of Africa and it was all blank. And so then you'd be going along and you'd like draw a card and you'd be like, river. And you'd take a crayon and trace in the river, and then you'd keep going along the river. But then at the end of the game, you just erase the whole thing. And then when you play it again, it could be a whole different river and mountains, desert. They didn't even know where anything was. I mean, it was like you kept redrawing this as if you were stepping out, exploring this world, and it was coming to view newly. There wasn't anything there until the explorers got there. So, you know, it's the idea that the world belongs to us, I guess, humans in general, but probably, at least in the colonial world, is a certain type of humans who are supposed to be occupying that world, a preformed surface waiting to be occupied, to be colonized first by living things and later by human, usually meaning Western civilization. There it is. Travel and exploration conquered the globe. In the globe world, as we saw, well, as we tried to say, that human activity was not necessarily the most important thing that was happening, but in the globe world, human activity is the most important thing. And so the world is sort of static or there, and we don't have anything, you know, it may be moving around, but we have nothing to do with it. We're the ones that are changing the world. We're not necessarily a part of the world. And we, of course, change the world through our technology. But if if our technology gets out of hand, what should we do, Willow? What should we do if there's something going wrong with our technologies so that we're messing up the world? How should we answer this? Fix it with more technology. So we see that technology becomes the way in which humans control the world. At least this is the idea in the global order, and we're going to fix it. We depend on more technology to fix what if we think we've messed it up, we would be able to fix it then on page 216. The sphere is, we know about the sphere because it's we learn about it from within. Back on page 210. Unlike the solid globe, which can only be perceived as such from without, spheres were to be perceived from within. And we learn about it by being out there, living. Privileges the knowledge we get from school by looking at model globes over the knowledge we get from life by actively participating in our surroundings. Of course, Ingold then has to say that he's not a flat earther. Doesn't want to be accused of that, like probably being accused of a creationist. He knows the world has the shape of a form of a globe, but how do we come to understand the world and to do it? So in the spherical perspective, the world, we're sort of at the center of the world. We live within it. And instead of human activity being the only thing that matters, we are one of many creatures, and the world itself playing our part in the world's transformation of itself. And Ingold calls this the cosmologies of engagement. So instead of this idea that humans as disengaged from the world or as approaching it from the outside or as being able to fix it with our technology, this is the idea of cosmologies of engagement. Now, one of the curious things about this chapter is that if we've read along in Ingold up until now, most of the time, he seems to be drawing a contrast between Western perspectives and for the most part, the non-West or the people outside of the West, indigenous perspectives. However, Gabe, what's the deal with this globe and sphere thing?
He just for the majority of his argument, he just references a ton of Western philosophy and beliefs, and then at one point he's okay, that isn't all, and then he puts one.
Yeah, he brought in that one. Yeah, I guess maybe I guess I'm less thrown by this. You seem you weren't so happy about that. I mean, he's making a point that that both of these perspectives can be found in the West. There's sort of this and I guess I would get down on Ingold if he hadn't spent the first, I don't know, 11 chapters talking to us about the Cree and the Inuit and all kinds of other people. This is the one of the few times I think that he draws a sort of he draws both of his examples from the West. So we've seen him do. There's one time also in this art chapter where he contrasted, different non-Western. He drew a lot of contrast between two different ontologies outside the West. But for the most part, he's kind of been like, he's been pretty concentrated on indigenous versus, I guess I would say. So, but it is true. Yeah. What were you gonna?
I thought he was kind of against cosmology.
That's true. Think about that for a second, though. Is he against cosmology? I guess my preliminary answer to that might be that this may be a if I'm looking at page 217, turn to local or indigenous cosmologies of engagement for sources of insight into our current predicament. I guess my preliminary idea would be on that is that he's against the idea that everybody has a cosmology, but that is separate from the way the world actually is. So, I mean, as long as you're kind of taking seriously the, how other people are describing the world and, engaging with it on a serious level, I guess I don't think the problem is necessarily the cosmology part, but it could also just be a throwaway line there in some ways because he's talking about the politics of it. This might become, I don't know if I want to say clearer, but it might be. I guess I would say there he's not necessarily concerned with that specific, like, the idea that people have worldviews and then we need to, he's just kind of, like I said, he's sort of using it as a one-off. The globe versus the sphere, under increasing threat from those, including many anthropologists who would turn to indigenous cosmologies of engagement for sources of insight. Yeah. I'm going to go with, it could be a one-off, or it could be that it's not necessarily that he's opposed to the idea of cosmology. It's just he's opposed to the idea that we're not taking others seriously when we just label everything they say as, oh, that's their cosmology, but it doesn't say anything about the world. So from earlier on, he has told us that there's an alternative image to the globe of far more ancient provenance. There's your European thought there, Gabe, and the image of the sphere, so that we have the globe as vision or contemplation, looking things from the outside, and the sphere as listening rather than looking, and a perspective from within. So again, I think he's saying that both of these perspectives can be found in the West, and that in some ways, perhaps both of these perspectives, maybe if you pushed him on it, that both these perspectives might be found in many different societies. And that's where the image of that unites them and leads us back to where we were just reading from about the cosmologies of engagement comes in as the image of, or the form of the dome. A sphere on the inside, a globe on the outside. This form has a cosmic resonance of near universal appeal. Near universal. Some people hate it, but almost everybody else loves domes. Everybody likes domes, except for a few people. But for any society at any period of its history, we may expect one perspective to be ascendant and the other to be associated with its more or less muted undercurrent. So we have spheres on the inside, domes on the outside. I mean, globes on the outside. And that's where we were reading. And my sense of the contemporary discourse on the environment in the West is that it continues to be dominated by global imagery associated with the triumph of modern science and technology, but that it is under increasing threat from those, including many anthropologists, who would turn to local or indigenous cosmology. I've read that a few times now. That's why I think it's in some ways the cosmologies is a throwaway line, because he's simply in some ways talking about this, here's the predominant trend, which is global environmental technology, versus a bunch of people who are starting to look for these other possibilities. So go for it, peeps. The dome. What do you think, Willa? Huh? You like domes? When was the last time you saw a dome? That's a good question to ask. When was the last time I saw a dome? Gabe, when was the last time you saw a dome? Did it have appeal?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
I think domes they're decent.
They're okay. I like the good domes. Yeah, they're all right. Oh, yeah. So the subtitle of this chapter is called The Topology of Environmentalism. Why would he do that? What the heck is he talking about? Topology of environmentalism. What do you do that for? Who's he after? Taking on these hippie environmentalists. So he's dealing with the idea that has, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's a common idea that that it was 1969, I guess. Is that when we landed on the moon? No, before, maybe a couple years. We went out into space, took some pictures, and that's when all the hippies got excited and the environmental movement was born, when we realized we were on one little planet. And that's all we had. And so the question was, well, we only have one planet. We only have one planet that we all have to share, so we have to manage it. How do we manage it better? As Ingold says, that it is ours to manage, however, remains more or less unquestioned. And so what he's saying here is that if we went from sort of this idea of humans as being the best ever to ecocentrism, that's just the other side of the coin from anthropocircumferentialism. What do you like better, domes or anthropocircumferentialism? Domes have near universal appeal, and if they're put against anthropocircumferentialism, they have universal appeal. Everybody likes domes better.
I had to Google and I couldn't find a single other website like referencing it.
You couldn't find anthropocircumferentialism anywhere? No. Well, that's too bad. Well, Google must have banned it or something, because Ingold says here, they've banned Ingold. Let's see. He says something about it. He says we need to have it. He's trying to bring it into Google. Maybe he needs to spend more time on the internet. It is an attitude that might be more accurately described as anthropocircumferentialism. The term may be an impossibly cumbersome one. Sure you typed it in correctly? Nevertheless, I believe we need it. We need it, Google. You hear me? If only to distinguish the discursive construction of the environment characteristic of modern Western thought and science from the many pre-modern and non-Western, Gabe, cosmologies that are anthropocentric in the strict sense of placing the human being at the hub of a dwelt-in world, blah, blah. So yes, he's saying that there was both this ancient or pre-modern way that unites with non-Western ways. So when we go from anthropocentrism to anthropocircumferentialism, we've withdrawn the human presence from the center to the periphery, and that's where we get these great diagrams of being in the center to being outside it, on top of it. And if you do ecocentrism, that's just like flipping the coin over, because then you have the environment, which doesn't, it's just, there's no place for us in it anymore. And then, you know, so he says that the idea that there's a global environment is the culmination of a process of separation. In the old days, I used to illustrate this by showing parts of the 10-hour series, The Race to Save the Planet. I kid you not, at Hartwick, you could go up to the library and there were these VHS tapes, and there were 10 of them called The Race to Save the Planet. I mean, it was unbelievably long, and it was made in 1990. You can now see them all on YouTube, thank goodness. And Meryl Streep would come on, and she said that we had to better, well, she's saying something about the place she owned in Connecticut, and we're caretaking the world. And then you had, you know, there it is, the globe from space. And then they, you know, then the music got all eerie when we had the agriculture come around. And then, you know, and then they were trying to convince us in 1990 that if we didn't do something in the next 10 years, it would all be over. And I used to make fun of this because it was like 2000 and we've made it to 2022, so I can still make fun of it because obviously we didn't do anything and we're still here. But I'm now starting to wonder if I was wrong to make fun of it, because maybe we did. Maybe we just lost the race to save the planet and now we're just kind of living it out, you know, and you know what I mean? don't have,
acid rain.
huh?
At least we don't have acid rain again.
Yeah, okay. There's some things that got better, right? We don't have the acid rain. The ozone hole seems to be not as big as it was gonna be. You know, a lot of rivers and well, we did some stuff. So yeah, we don't want to get depressed and say that the race is already lost. But it is true that most of the time now they're just like, okay, we got to get it down to a certain number of parts per million of CO2 just to avoid complete catastrophe. Anyway, it was a good example of this idea that the world is a globe and we had to techno fix it up. And then in the old days, I used to also show the South Park episode Rainforest Schmainforest, which if you want to see this on your own, it's I can't recommend it, and you can't see it on YouTube because they won't let you, but you know, if you can find it somewhere, it's in some ways it's about, the reason I show it is because this teacher brings this group of kids. Don't worry, the South Park boys are not themselves environmentalists, but they're very environmental, and they go down to Costa Rica, and there's all sorts of terrible things that they're stereotyping Costa Rica as, and you know, it's that South Park vibe of like, okay, are they making fun of the racists, or are they just jerks, you know, that kind of thing. But you know what happens to this teacher is she goes from like wanting to save the rainforest to wanting to bulldoze the rainforest in like about 20 minutes of, you know. And so it's, the idea is that the technology stuff is if you are into the technology fix, it's very easy to switch back and forth. It's the same, it's the other side of the coin, and the point is to switch the coin. I was going to show it, but then I guess the ways in which how to say, are they mocking homophobia, or are they just being homophobic, right? I don't know. I'm not willing to now show something where they're getting gay with kids and then using that word in a whole bunch of different ways. So I don't show that anymore, but I won't even recommend it. But it's a good example of how we can use technology, and it flips back and forth.